Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. If you're new here, consider subscribing. It really helps keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now, sit back, relax, and let's get into the story. I did not think of myself as a survival expert. I was an office assistant who liked camping twice a year and kept a small plastic bin with a propane stove, a first aid kit, and a few spare batteries. I lived on the third floor of a brick apartment building near Glenwood Avenue in Raleigh, North Carolina, a 15-minute bus ride from downtown if traffic was light. I had bottled water, a backpacking filter I bought on sale, and a toolbox with a hammer, screwdrivers, and duct tape. I kept some extra canned food because it was convenient and cheap. That was the full list of my advantages when the outbreak started moving through local hospitals and then across the city. On the night everything turned, the emergency sirens did not stop. I heard them at around 9 p.m., then again at 10:30 p.m., then continuously until I fell asleep with shoes on. Around midnight, someone pounded on a door down the hall and shouted for help. Then there was a thud, then quiet, then more sirens. I kept my phone charging, checked news sites until they all stalled, and listened to the police scanner app until it crashed. The last clear thing I heard before the app froze was a dispatcher mentioning WakeMed Raleigh campus diverting patients and an instruction to avoid the emergency department entrances because of dangerous crowd behavior. I turned the volume down. I moved the couch against my front door and dragged the bookcase behind it. I covered the peephole with a sticker because the hallway lights flickered and it made me jump. I sealed the air vents with painter's tape to reduce odors, closed the bathroom door to keep one room clean and quiet, and stacked my camping gear by the balcony door in case I needed to move in a hurry. I slept for a couple of hours and woke to helicopters and a distant, constant roar that I first thought was wind. It was not wind. It was the city. By morning, the elevator was dead. When I opened my front door, I did it with my shoulder pushing the couch back a few inches at a time and my hand wrapped around a long screwdriver like a handle. I checked the hallway. It smelled like stale air and burned dust. 2 doors down, the frame was splintered and the lock plate was bent. I closed my door again and pushed the couch back into place. I made coffee with water I'd filled the night before. It was a small comfort, but it did 2 things that mattered. It kept me calm, and it reminded me that I still had routines that worked. I sat by the balcony and watched Glenwood, which was clogged with empty cars. A delivery van was half on the curb with its back doors open. No one moved on the sidewalk. A block away, something toppled and the sound echoed up the street and into the courtyard between our buildings. I learned in that moment that noise traveled farther than I wished and bounced off the brick like it had an amplifier. I kept my phone on airplane mode to save power and turned on my hand crank radio. After a few minutes of careful tuning, I found NOAA Weather Radio on 162.550 MHz, the Raleigh transmitter. It was reading a routine forecast. The regular voice felt like a lifeline even though it had no advice for what we were facing. I left it low and scanned the FM band until I found a station relaying emergency messages. Stay inside. Avoid contact with those acting aggressively. Do not approach crowds. Wait for official instructions. The message repeated. There were no official instructions about where those instructions would come from. I started making my place quieter. I taped a blanket behind the balcony glass to reduce light. I stacked books against the inside of the balcony door to reduce rattling. I set an alarm on my watch to remind me to check the stove knobs and unplug power strips to lower any chance of an electrical fire. I moved everything I could into places where it would not fall if the building shook or if someone pounded on the walls. It was not much, but it cut down on sudden noises that could move from my apartment into the hall. I rationed the first day the way a cautious person does when they think help is just around the corner. I ate a normal breakfast, a small lunch, and then told myself to go easy at dinner. Around 7 p.m., the sirens ramped up again. The helicopters came low. From the balcony, I saw a group running up the sidewalk, looking behind them. One fell, the others kept going, and then a second group moved in a strange, unbalanced way that I did not understand until they were almost under the streetlights. The first group had the posture of people who were tired and in a hurry. The second group moved as if they did not care if they tripped or scraped themselves on the curb. They moved toward the noise like it was a beacon. I stepped back from the glass. I reached for my phone and then put it down. I did not record anything. I did not need a record. I needed quiet. That night, I slept in my clothes with my backpack packed next to me. Inside, I put 2 liters of water, the first aid kit, a headlamp, a small roll of duct tape, the screwdriver, a folding multi-tool, a cheap rain jacket, 4 energy bars, and a map I took from a drawer, a North Carolina road atlas I used for weekend trips. I kept the propane stove and fuel canisters near the balcony in a plastic tote. I laid out my rain fly from the camping tent so I could hang it as a light blocker or cut it for a tarp. On day 2, the power failed completely. The last flicker happened just before dawn, and then the apartment went silent in a way I had never heard before. The refrigerator hummed down. The air conditioner quit. The normal noise of the building stopped. I heard individual footsteps outside for the first time, and whispers, and once a soft knock that moved door to door like someone was trying to find a friend and was afraid to speak. I did not open my door. I made oatmeal with a small amount of water and ate it slowly. When I opened the balcony door to vent the steam, I kept my body behind the frame and draped the blanket so only a narrow gap allowed the vapor out. I watched the plume rise and vanish, and felt relieved that it did not make visible smoke. From then on, I cooked only when wind conditions were steady and I could control the steam and smell. I had meat in my freezer that would spoil. I decided to cook as much as I could in one session, wrap servings, and let them cool before I sealed them in containers. The balcony became my tiny kitchen. I set the single-burner stove on a cast-iron griddle so heat would not scorch the wood. I used a large pot as a lid to trap steam, and then ran a saline test on my seal. I held a lit match near the blanket gap and watched how the flame leaned to confirm air was flowing out, not in. It helped to keep kitchen odors moving away from the apartment. It also helped me avoid pulling in unknown air from the hallway. I kept a fire extinguisher next to my leg at all times. I did not leave the stove unattended, not even for a second. By late morning, on day 2, I had a plan for food. Cook what would spoil first, portion it with rice and canned vegetables, and eat cold when possible to avoid smells. I noted water use. Each meal took a half cup to a cup. Washing dishes took more than I liked, so I wiped pans with paper towels and a small amount of oil before cooking to make cleanup easier. I set a daily water budget. 2 liters for drinking, 1 liter for cooking and minimal hygiene. It was a guess based on how long I thought my bottled water would last and the chance of rain. It felt tight, but it was better to be strict early. I checked the stairwell and the roof access. The stairwell doors had fire-rated closers, and the roof hatch was locked. The key box in the maintenance room downstairs was behind a metal door. I was not going to risk running around the ground floor yet. From the 3rd-floor landing window, I could see the courtyard. It had a central lawn, a few low trees, and a gas grill near the pool that was surrounded by a fence. Someone had draped a blanket over the grill at some point. The blanket fluttered like a flag. I kept the stairwell door to my floor firmly shut to trap sound. On day 3, I realized there would be no easy fix. The elevators remained dead. The taps still had a slow flow because the building retained pressure, but the water was not safe to assume clean. The toilets worked when you poured water manually. I filled the bathtub with water on day 1, which was good, but I'd not cleaned the tub beforehand with the assumption I would be boiling everything anyway. That mistake would add work later. I kept the tub covered with a shower curtain to cut down on dust and evaporation. Midday, I started a written log. On the first page I wrote, "Objective, survived to day 30. Under that, I laid out a simple checklist: water, food, quiet, hygiene, watch. I wrote watch because there was no better word for the time blocks I planned to sit still, listen, and observe patterns from the balcony and from the peephole. I set 4 watches: early morning, midday, late afternoon, and late night, 20 minutes each. I made a habit of rating each watch S, safe, U, uncertain, or D, dangerous, based on sound level and observed movement. It was a crude system, but patterns appeared. The courtyard was quietest between 4:30 a.m. and 6:30 a.m. The street noise increased in the late afternoon as people tried to move. The most unpredictable time was after sunset, when small noises triggered chain reactions. A car alarm meant lights. Lights meant movement. Movement meant more movement. I got hungry in the afternoon and ate more than I should. I wrote down the calories and put a line through the number to make it clear I could not take it back. That was the moment the log became part of my discipline. Without it, I would have drifted into reacting to the day. With it, I saw decisions on paper and could not pretend I had done better than I had. That evening, someone in the next building shouted for help from a balcony. The voice carried across the courtyard and down the street. Within seconds, figures below turned in that direction. Then more figures. Then the slow stream from the far end of the block became a line. I stepped away from the glass and knelt by the couch until it ended. It did end, but it took time. The sound had spread and collected listeners the way a bell collects students. I did not sleep well after that. I replayed everything about how my own balcony might sound to someone below and used a small towel under the door to muffle any clink of metal. On day 4, I switched from reacting to building systems. I turned the shower curtain into a rain catchment by cutting triangular wedges from the corners and folding them into channels that directed water toward the center when hung over the balcony railing. I rigged a funnel from a cut soda bottle and taped it to a pot. I tied the curtain with paracord so wind would not flip it. Rain was not in the forecast, but forecasts were not promises, and I wanted the system ready. I tested it with a pitcher and learned it sagged in the center unless I added a dowel. I used a broom handle. I added a second line to pull the center down to increase the slope. I noted how long the pot took to fill with a steady flow. The log got precise: 1 liter every 8 minutes under the test flow. Real rain would be less efficient, but it was better than guessing. I also made a rope basket system for possible trade. I took a storage basket, drilled holes in the rim with a screwdriver and patience, and threaded paracord through 4 corners to make a level hanger. I tied the lines together and ran them over the balcony railing and under the blanket so I could lower the basket without leaning out. I tested the weight limit with heavy cans. The line creaked but held. I wrote in the log, "Trade line ready, use only with caution." Late that afternoon, I used a hand mirror I kept in a drawer to check the courtyard without exposing myself. Angling the mirror around the edge of the balcony frame gave me a wide view with a small profile. It was a trick I learned from an old camping book that had a chapter on signaling. I held the mirror flat, used my other hand to make a small sight between thumb and index finger, and rotated until sunlight flashed where I aimed. I swept slowly across the windows of the building opposite, once, then again. I did not expect a reply. I got one, anyway, a clean blink, 3 quick flashes from a window on the 4th floor across the courtyard. I felt my pulse climb. I looked again, 3 flashes. I did not know any formal code, so I used a simple pattern: 2 slow flashes for hello, 1 long for wait. The other window gave me 1 long. I lowered the mirror and breathed out. I made a message sign from printer paper. I am on 3rd floor, building C, quiet. Will signal at 10 a.m. daily. I used a thick marker, the kind you smell even with the cap on. I held it to the glass for a few seconds and then took it down. It was not safe to put a sign in the window permanently. If the wrong eyes saw it, it could invite trouble. A temporary hold was enough to coordinate. The next day, at 10 a.m., I used the mirror again. 3 flashes appeared. I lifted the sign for 5 seconds. You okay? A hand appeared in the opposite window with a thumbs up. Then another sign. Mr. Kim, maintenance. He held a second sign. Roof key in office. He followed with third. Office broken. We built a simple conversation over 2 days using signs and flashes. He advised me to check the water main in the basement if I ever had to go down, and to shut the building valve if a pipe burst to keep the place from flooding. He told me generators on the property were small and not worth the risk now. He showed me a broken arm sling and wrote, "Bad fall, staying put." He wrote that if I needed the roof, there might be a second way through the maintenance closet in Building B where the hatch lock was sometimes left open for contractors. He asked if I had food. I held up 2 cans and a thumbs up. He nodded and flashed twice. Then his blinds closed. On day 6, the hallway outside my apartment smelled like smoke for the first time. Not heavy, not a house fire, more like burned plastic. I took my fire extinguisher, put on my hiking boots, and moved the couch slowly off the door. I listened. When I cracked the door 3 inches, I heard nothing but a far-off tapping, like someone trying a locked knob every minute. I stepped into the hall, closed my door without letting the latch click, and felt the air. Warm, but not hot. I checked both ends of the corridor. The smoke seemed to be drifting from the stairwell below rather than a single unit. I retreated, locked my door, pushed the couch back, and sealed the bottom gap with a wet towel. The smell faded. That night, I wrote out a rule set on the inside cover of the log. Sound control. No loud cooking, no dropped items, no doors slamming, no yelling. Light control. Blackout after sunset. Candles only behind 2 layers of cloth, no window light. Movement control. No hallway trips unless necessary, stairs only at 4:30 a.m., 5:30 a.m. window. Watch discipline, 4 watches per day, even if tired. Food discipline. 1,600 calories per day maximum, with planned swaps for exertion days. Water discipline, 2 liters drink, 1 liter other, boil 5 minutes if uncertain. Fire control. Stove never unattended, extinguisher ready, wet towel nearby. Contact control. No door openings unless I control the space and sound. Exit plan. Packed bag near bed, shoes on, keys taped to strap. Writing rules made me feel less like I was waiting and more like I was working. On day 7, it rained. It started with a metallic tapping on the balcony railing at 6:10 a.m. I got up, set the curtain catchment, and watched water fill the pot in a steady stream. The rate was not as good as my test, but it was enough to make a real difference. I collected 6 liters in the first pass, poured them into clean containers, then set the pot again. I boiled 2 liters on the stove for 5 minutes and let them cool with lids on to prevent airborne dust. I tasted a little and logged it. The water tasted flat, which meant it was good enough. I cannot overstate how much better I felt just seeing clear water in bottles I had filled myself. It changed my posture and my breathing. Day 8, I slept later than I meant to after the night watches. When I woke, the building was quiet but not empty. People were moving behind walls. I heard measured footsteps, not the unsteady kind. A small group knocked on doors on the first floor and tried handles. They did not talk. They moved carefully and used metal on one lock. I stayed still. After they left, I checked the peephole and found a strip of tape stuck over it from the outside. That meant someone had approached my door while I slept. I removed the tape and added a simple interior alarm. I tied 3 metal washers on a thin thread across the inside of the door so that if the door moved, they would ring against the knob. It would not stop anyone, but I would wake faster. In the afternoon, I weighed the risk of a short scavenging trip to the neighboring building to look for the maintenance hatch that Mr. Kim mentioned. The courtyard was empty. The weather was clearing. The 4:30 a.m. window would be better, but the roof offered a new path and perhaps line of sight to anything useful on adjacent rooftops. I waited for a full cycle of my watches. At 5:10 p.m., I decided to wait one more day. Patience saved me. At 5:30 p.m., a rushing sound moved through the courtyard, followed by 2 sets of hard steps and then a clatter, and then silence. I did not investigate. Day 9. I spent the morning on a project to reduce hallway odors from my unit. Every time I cooked, tiny smells escaped. I made a double curtain inside the door with 2 blankets hung a foot apart on tension rods to make a baffle. I cut small slits at the top so air from the apartment could move into the hall without carrying light. It worked better than tape at the threshold, and I could pull the blankets aside easily to move in and out. The hallway grew cooler, and the apartment smelled less like food. That kept attention away from my door. At 10 a.m., I signaled Mr. Kim. No answer. I waited and flashed again. Nothing. I wrote in the log, "No contact, Mr. Kim." I did not write anything else because there was nothing useful to add. I kept the watch. On day 10, I made the rooftop plan real. I cut a length of paracord and tied 2 alpine butterfly loops a foot apart so I would have handholds that did not slip under load. I wrapped duct tape around the sections where the rope might rub. I tied a figure 8 on a bight at the end to clip to a carabiner if I found an anchor. I practiced throwing the weighted end up to a small beam inside my closet to make sure my shoulder motion was quiet. I practiced climbing the rope in a controlled way with my feet against the wall. My hands blistered by the 3rd try. I taped my palms and learned to move slower. Everything I did was slow now. It was the only way I could keep track of noise and breath. Before dawn, on day 11, during the quiet window, I moved into the stairwell with the rope coiled in a bag, the screwdriver in my pocket, and my pack on my back. I wore fingerless gloves so I could still feel the rope and metal. I counted steps. Every stairwell has its own pitch. Ours had a soft ring on the 5th step of each flight. I learned to edge my foot near the wall where the sound did not carry. I moved up to the 4th floor landing and checked through the small window into Building B's hall. No movement. I opened the fire door a half-inch and waited for 2 minutes with my breath low. Still nothing. I slid out. The maintenance closet at the end of the hall had a standard knob lock. The strike plate was cheap. I wrapped the knob with a towel and turned slowly until the latch yielded. Inside, the air smelled of oil and dust. I closed the door and wedged it with a wedge I had whittled from a scrap. I had the sense to place the wedge in my pocket before I left home. That small piece of wood felt like a key. The maintenance closet had a ladder bolted to the wall leading to a square hatch. The hatch was secured with a padlock. The hasp screws were on the inside. I used the screwdriver and carefully backed each screw out with slow pressure, catching them in my palm so they would not hit the floor. The lock remained closed, but the hasp came away. I pushed the hatch up enough to look. Bright light and a low hum of wind. I eased the hatch open, slid the rope through, and tied off to the ladder rung. I tested it with my weight. It held. I hooked the rope's loop to my belt and stepped onto the roof. From the roof, I saw Raleigh in a layout I had only noticed on maps. The curve of Capitol Boulevard. The cluster of downtown buildings to the southeast. The green corridors of Pigeon House Branch and the patches of oak lining side streets. smoke rose in two thin columns from the direction of North Hills. Closer, the rooftops formed a series of terraced plains connected by the occasional metal bridge over parking lot gaps. I did a slow 360-degree scan, counting potential crossing points and noting anything that could serve as cover. On one rooftop, I saw a row of solar path lights, the kind sold for gardens. I made a note to collect a few for indoor charging and evening light. On another roof, a blue tarp flapped and banged with each gust. I marked it as a hazard. Noise that repeats invites attention. I lowered myself back into the closet, replaced the hasp with 2 screws so it would not draw the eye, and left the closet the way I found it, including the wedge fallen on the floor to look like it had been jostled by vibration. I returned to my apartment by 5:40 a.m., made tea with a small amount of water, and wrote out a new route plan. Rooftop crossings at dawn, no movement after 6:30 a.m., bring 1 plank for gap bridging. Target nearby building with good sight lines and possible supplies that did not require entry. Day 12, rain returned and kept me inside. I collected 8 more liters and set 2 aside for a reserve. I ate cold food to eliminate stove smells and practiced the mirror code at 10 a.m. just in case. No reply. I wrote down that my battery supply would last 3 more weeks if I kept careful with the headlamp. I replaced nightly candle use with the charged solar path lights. I set them on the balcony during the day, covered by the blanket from street view, and brought them in after dark for soft light that did not show at the windows. It was weak, but it was safer than an open flame. On day 13, I tested the rope basket trade system with an empty basket to check line noise. It made a soft swish against the wall that you could not hear more than a floor away. I lowered it halfway and left it for a minute. When I pulled it up, there was a note inside written on the torn corner of a magazine. "Do you have rice?" The handwriting was neat and small. I looked across but could not see anyone watching. I wrote back, "Yes. Do you have batteries, AA?" I lowered the basket again and waited. It returned with 2 AA batteries and another note. 2 for 1 cup rice? I did the math in my head. 2 batteries for 1 cup was steep, but information came with any trade, and I had more rice than batteries, and I could spare a cup. I put a measuring cup in the basket, then a sealed bag with the rice, then slowly lowered it. A different hand returned the basket with the batteries and a third note. "Thank you." No names, no apartment number. That was good. I logged it as success and wrote a rule. No more than 1 trade per week, no identifiable items in basket, no face-to-face, no talking. Day 14, I started a health routine. I washed with a small cloth in a bowl of warm water at noon each day, brushed my teeth carefully to protect them because dental issues would be serious without clinics, stretched for 15 minutes, and did short sets of slow squats and wall push-ups to keep my legs and arms working. I wore clean socks and kept my feet dry. I cut my nails at the sink and captured the pieces in tissue to reduce mess. It felt clinical, but small preventions were control, and control mattered. That evening, I heard footsteps on the roof. Not heavy, not running deliberate. I sat still by the door with the screwdriver and my headlamp off. The steps paused above my unit and then moved toward the far side of the building. I waited a half hour before I moved. After that, I set an additional watch between 8 p.m. and 9 p.m. for rooftop movement. I added a line to my rules. No roof trips after dawn. Lock hatch when possible. Never leave tools outside. Day 15, I checked my food. 6 cans of beans, 5 cans of peaches, 4 of corn, 3 of tuna, 2 jars of peanut butter, rice, pasta, olive oil, salt, and spices. The freezer food was gone. I planned meals around 400 calories each 4 times per day when I expected work, 3 times per day when I did not. I wrote a 7-day rotation that repeated. It sounds repetitive, but it removed the stress of deciding. Decision fatigue makes people sloppy. Sloppy makes noise. At 10 a.m., I signaled across the courtyard again. This time, a figure appeared briefly, gave a small wave, and disappeared. No signs. I chose to interpret that as alive, and left it at that. Day 16 through day 18 blended into a steady pattern broken by small events. On day 16, I harvested 4 solar path lights from the roof of the adjacent building by crossing a metal utility bridge at dawn. I clipped them to my pack and moved back slowly. On day 17, I heard a military message on the radio with an automated voice referencing roadblocks on I-40 and I-440 and advising people to avoid major interchanges. On day 18, a gas station near the corner of Glenwood and a side street had a small fire that burned itself out in the rain. Each event went in log with time and direction. I added arrows and simple maps. It was my way of keeping my head straight. On day 19, I was low on fresh protein and decided to risk one controlled scavenging trip. The target was a small pharmacy 2 blocks away, not for prescriptions but for basic supplies. Bandages, antiseptic, and possibly a manual can opener if mine failed. I also wanted a few packs of rehydration salts. I left at 5:05 a.m. I wore a gray hoodie and carried the pack close to my body. I moved down the stairs, paused at each landing to listen, and exited the building through the laundry room door into the alley rather than the front lobby. The alley was clear. I kept to the shadow line along the building, stepped over broken glass in slow arcs to avoid crunch, and froze twice when distant noises moved toward me. The pharmacy had a steel gate that was pulled down but not locked. The door behind it had been forced days earlier, the lock plate broken. Inside, the air smelled like cardboard and damp plaster. I kept my headlamp on low and moved straight to first aid. I took bandages, gauze, tape, a bottle of antiseptic, 2 small bottles of pain reliever, and a thermometer. I passed shelves of snacks and took nothing that would crinkle. I took soap. I took a small bottle of bleach and triple-bagged it in case of leaks. I took batteries, then stopped at the register and left a $20 bill, folded, on the counter. It did not matter in a practical sense, but it mattered to me to keep a line I would not cross. On the way out, I heard steps on the sidewalk and stayed behind a shelf until the sound passed and did not return. I reached home by 6:10 a.m. and wrote, "Trip complete, no contact." On day 20, the emotional gravity of the month caught up. I slept sitting up. I dreamed I had left the stove on and woke in a panic to check it twice. I heard a woman crying 2 floors below at around 2 a.m. and held myself still so the sound would not pull me toward decisions I could not control. I cleaned the apartment, sorted supplies, washed a shirt in a bucket with a teaspoon of detergent, and hung it behind the blackout curtain. I let myself cry for 5 minutes when no sounds moved in the courtyard. I set a timer on my watch. When it beeped, I stopped, drank a cup of water, and returned to the rules. The rules were not there to trap me. They were there to save me when feelings tried to make big decisions alone. On day 21, a small fire started in a unit across the courtyard. I noticed it because a thin thread of brown smoke bled from a window frame at 8:40 p.m. Seconds later, a flicker glowed at the glass and then vanished. Then the smoke returned stronger. I went to the kitchen, filled a pot, and stood ready, knowing I could not help across the gap. From the roof came footsteps, and the hatch on Building B banged open. A silhouette moved quickly to the edge, looked down, then ran back. Minutes later, a second figure appeared with a fire extinguisher, but they were on the wrong building. The fire took longer to grow than it would have with open oxygen because the place was sealed, but it grew. People do not know how to handle smoke. They open windows to let it out. That pulls in more air and feeds the flames. I braced for shouting, but none came. The fire guttered and then took the curtains, and then nothing happened for 5 minutes, and then the window glass crumbled and the room snapped bright. The blaze stayed local. The building did not light like a match, but the heat pushed upward. Smoke drifted toward my building and into the courtyard. The air smelled like treated wood and plastic. I gathered my pack and kept my shoes on. I placed wet towels under my door and moved the couch back by the peephole so I could sit and monitor the hallway. The alarm washers rattled once, then stopped. The smoke thinned around 10:15 p.m. I made a note. Fire in Building A, Unit 4XX, contained after window failed. Cross-ventilation risk high. It was the ignition I needed to move from planning to leaving. I had prepared a rooftop route. I had a bag packed. I had signals, and a chart of quiet times and a grip on my fear. What I did not have anymore was a building I could rely on to survive another random event at 2 in the morning. If one apartment could go, others could go. If smoke could push into the hallways from a unit I could not reach, a second fire might push into mine, and I would end up stumbling through a smoke-filled stairwell with no lights, coughing and tripping on the metal ridge at the threshold because the blanket in front of my face hid my feet. I set day 22 as prep day and day 23 as my rooftop escape window. On day 22, I reviewed the essentials in the pack: water, small food rations, the rope, a folded moving blanket, a compact solar light, first aid, extra socks, a rain jacket, a hat, a small map of the city with my route marked in pencil, and the multi-tool. I added a metal water bottle in case I needed to boil over a small flame elsewhere. I placed a flat pry bar from my toolbox on the outside of the pack for quick access. I tested the weight, 22 pounds. I could carry it for hours without hurting my knees if I kept a steady pace. I wrote my path: leave my unit at 4:45 a.m., cross to Building B via the interior corridor, up to the maintenance closet, to the roof, collect 2 more solar path lights, move south along 3 connected rooftops, descend a fire escape to a short alley, cross into a low office building with an accessible stair to the roof, then traverse 2 more, then cut west toward a separate complex that backed onto a greenway that paralleled a small creek. Greenways have fewer cars, fewer blind corners, and better drainage. The risk was open sight lines, but sunrise would give me enough light to move without a headlamp yet, not enough to draw the eye. I slept in short cycles and woke before the alarm. On day 23, at 4:40 a.m., I opened my door and stepped into the hall. The washer alarm chimed softly against the knob. I pressed the washers with my palm to mute them as I closed the door and turned the lock. I took a last look at the number on the frame and let it go. I moved down the hall, east through the stairwell door, and descended to the landing with the maintenance closet. The hatch remained loose as I left it. I was on the roof by 5 a.m. I crossed the first roof easily, keeping my weight low. 1 step per breath, feet placed on firm points and not on loose pebbles. The second roof had a broad seam that made a hollow thump when I stepped in the wrong spot. I marked the seam with a small piece of tape so I could avoid it on a return, then realized there would be no return, and folded the tape back into my pocket. I moved to the far edge and peered down to the alley. Empty. I lowered myself to the fire escape. The ladder squeaked 1 notch as it extended. I froze, hands flat on the metal, until the sound faded into the city noise of birds and distant wet tires from somewhere on Peace Street. At the bottom, I stepped onto the alley and scanned left, then right. The air was cool and smelled like damp earth and old oil. At the corner, I heard the unmistakable uneven footfalls I had learned to recognize. I pulled back into the shadow and waited. A figure moved past the mouth of the alley, arms slightly out, head tilted. It moved toward a sound I could not hear. When it turned the corner, I moved the other way. Quick but controlled, and reached the back door of the office building I had targeted. The door had a push bar from the inside and a key cylinder outside. The glass was intact. I did not want to break glass. Next to the door was a metal service panel with a latch. Inside the panel, a key box. It was empty. Maintenance had been here before. I followed the wall to a side door and found a small ventilation window above it with a rusted latch on the inside. I used the screwdriver to lift the latch through the mesh and push the glass up enough to reach the interior lock. The door opened. I closed it softly behind me. Inside, the building smelled unused. Carpets absorb smells, then release them in humidity. It was a neutral smell that meant less attention. I took the stairs 2 at a time to the roof access and found it unlocked. On the roof, I could see the greenway. I could also see the eastern sky brightening. It was time to move faster. Rooftop to rooftop, I counted steps and paused at each gap. I used the moving blanket as a short bridge once where HVAC ducts were close enough. I checked each landing for loose items that could slide and make noise. On the last building before the greenway, I crouched low behind an edge and watched the path. A deer moved along the tree line. No people. The creek ran low. On the far side, a raised highway, probably the I-440 beltline, hummed softly. I did not want highways. I wanted more trees. The fire escape down to the greenway dropped into a small fenced area. The gate was locked with a chain. I considered climbing, then considered how noise travels when metal meets metal. I pulled the chain up a few inches to take slack, then twisted until the links grabbed each other. That gave me space to slide the end of the pry bar between the gate and the post. I pushed gently. The latch gave a half-inch and then more. The chain stayed taut. I slipped through without letting the chain bang the post. On the greenway, I set a new rule. No stopping on bridges, no standing in the open more than 30 seconds, no doubling back unless forced. I kept to the tree side and used the sound of the creek to cover my footsteps. When I passed the first overpass, I heard a helicopter, distant and then closer. I moved under the bridge and pressed against the concrete. The helicopter did not stop. It moved south and then east. The sound faded. I stepped back into the path and continued. I followed the greenway west and then north, avoiding the main roads. It felt like a trip I could have taken on a Sunday morning with a thermos and a friend, except the city to my right was silent in all the wrong ways. I marked the time. By 7:20 a.m., people would be moving more. I needed to choose a place to wait out the day and then plan the second stage to the suburbs. I left the path at a spot where a billboard stood on steel poles above a patch of scrub between the greenway and a small service road. The area had good visibility and cover at the same time. I could watch the greenway at an angle and see the road through gaps in the brush. I walked the perimeter, found an old pallet and a broken barrier that I could use as a windbreak, and set a small camp of sorts. Moving blanket on the ground, pack against the pole, hat brim low. I ate a measured lunch of peanut butter on crackers and a small can of peaches for liquid and sugar. I sipped water and wrote in the log, position under billboard, quiet. Plan night move to outer neighborhoods. The day passed in short watches and longer silences. I monitored the pattern of walkers on the greenway. Most were the slow, drifting kind, with heads turned toward any sound. Occasionally, I saw people in small groups hugging the tree line and moving quickly. None stopped near me. The billboard kept my silhouette broken, and the breeze carried my scent up and away. At 3:30 p.m., distant pops rolled from the direction of downtown, then a low boom like a demolition charge or a gas main. The sky to the southeast showed a new smudge. At sunset, I prepared for the second move. The target was a cluster of low buildings near a suburban strip where the road widened, and there were likely fewer multi-story traps. I wanted a spot with a view and a way out in multiple directions. I used side streets and cut through back lots, staying a building's width off the main road. Twice I hid behind dumpsters when vehicles moved. One vehicle was a pickup with a makeshift light bar and 4 people in the bed scanning alleys. They did not see me. Another was a police SUV with doors open and no one inside, rolling slowly until it bumped the curb and stopped. I watched it for a long minute to make sure no one was behind it and then crossed the street. By 9 p.m., I had reached a low office park with a flat roof and a billboard above it. It mirrored my daytime hide. I found an exterior stair that led to the roof without an alarm. On the roof, I checked the edges, set the moving blanket in the lee of a low wall, and ate a small meal. I used the solar path light for a few minutes to check my map and then switched it off. The path light glow is a tone that does not carry far, but even small light at height can be seen a long way in a city dark. I slept in short segments and woke often to listen. Once, late in the night, I heard a controlled series of dull thumps in the distance that could only be large ordnance striking. The sound rolled and then faded. There was no follow-up. The helicopter appeared again, low for a moment, then gone. Day 24, I wrote a new objective. Reach a belt of neighborhoods where 2-story houses stood with space between them, where I could camp in a backyard shed or an attic with good ventilation and a second exit. My plan was no longer to hold the apartment. It was to move, rest, and stay ahead of large groups, avoiding both the slow and the desperate. I felt guilty about leaving the people I had traded with across the courtyard, but the fire had decided the question. Staying would have turned into waiting for a problem I could not fix. I crossed the office park and found a convenience store with its front smashed open. I did not go in. The open mouth of a store attracts more than it provides after the first day. I took a side door into an adjacent dry cleaner and cut around through a hallway that led to the rear lot. I kept my ears tuned to a specific range of sounds. The scuff of a shoe on grit, the irregular drag of feet, the high click of a ring of keys swinging. I did not hear any of those. A pair of crows called from a power line. I passed under and kept going. I found a small neighborhood on a rise with a view back towards downtown. The houses were wood frame with brick fronts and asphalt shingles. A few cars sat in driveways. One house had its front door wide open and a wind chime clinking in the doorway. I did not approach that one. Another had a tool shed in the back with a lock. I went to the side yard and waited behind a hedge and watched for 15 minutes. No movement in the windows. I checked the ground for recent tracks and found none. I approached the shed and examined the lock. It was a basic hasp with a padlock. The hinge screws were exposed. I unscrewed the bottom hinge, lifted the door an inch, and slipped it off the top hinge without touching the lock. The door moved with a soft groan. Inside, the air smelled of grass and oil. I stepped in and replaced the door behind me by setting it onto the top hinge and screwing in the bottom. I turned the hasp into place so a casual glance would show it secured. I sat on a low stool and counted my supplies. I drank a cup of water, then closed my eyes. I heard a car pass on the main road far away. I heard leaves shift. I heard my own breath. I let my shoulders drop. I slept in a half-doze until late afternoon, then checked the house again from the shed. Still quiet, I decided to stay the night and leave at dawn. I ate rice with a little oil and a packet of tuna. I wrote the day's events and checked my feet for hot spots. One heel was tender. I layered a piece of moleskin from the first aid kit. Small fixes keep small problems from becoming big ones. Day 25, I took a new path along a utility corridor that paralleled a creek. I crossed beneath a small bridge where a local road passed overhead. The water ran clear in patches and smelled clean enough to filter. I marked it for later in case rain stopped. The corridor led to a suburban commercial zone with a grocery store and a cluster of small businesses. The grocery store doors were closed and the glass was intact. The pharmacy that shared the parking lot had its metal shutter pulled down, bent outward. I kept moving. I aimed for a warehouse with an external staircase and a good roof line. Warehouses have fewer interior walls. If you need to move fast, straight lines help. I reached the stairs at 6:20 a.m., climbed to the landing, and found the roof door locked. It was a commercial lock with a hardened cylinder. Not worth the noise. I backed down and moved around to the loading dock. The dock doors were closed. A person stood on the far edge of the lot next to a compact car with one door open. He saw me and raised a hand slowly. He looked as tired as I felt. Behind him, in the open door of the car, something shifted. I raised my hand in return and kept my body angled. He called out, a low voice, 2 words. "You safe?" I shook my head and pointed to my ear and then to the trees. He looked past me. He lowered his hand. He closed his car door gently and got in. He did not start the engine. I kept moving. By late morning, heat began to build. I sheltered in the shade of a stand of pines and ate a small lunch. A droning sound like a small aircraft passed high overhead. A distant siren came and went. Unusual now that the city had settled into its new condition. I thought of my apartment and of Mr. Kim's window across the courtyard. I felt like I had walked away from a team I had never met. I wrote, "Survival is not a vote. It is a set of actions." Day 26 through day 28. I stayed moving and added to my rules as I learned. I learned that open parking lots were traps because they offered no cover and drew attention the way a flat plane draws wind. I learned that long grass hides glass and that glass chews the edges of shoe soles until they fail. I taped my soles at night with strips of duct tape to protect them until I could find better shoes. I learned that a quiet hey at a normal volume was better than a whisper when I needed to signal someone from a distance, because a whisper can carry oddly and attract exactly the wrong ears. I used it once to warn a pair of people to stay back as I cut around an alleyway. They stayed back. We all kept moving. At a small office supply store on day 27, I found an unopened pack of spiral notebooks and a mechanical pencil. I felt like picking up a tool that I could use as a lever on my own head. I wrote down a list of lessons from the month. The sound moves like water around corners and collects in low spots. Stand at corners and listen before you step. 1 extra minute at dawn is worth 10 at noon. Check door thresholds with your toes before committing your weight. Thresholds trip when you rush. Water is heavy. Plan routes around fill points to carry less for shorter periods. People are unpredictable. Groups are more predictable than individuals. Avoid both if you can. Your plan is not fragile if it has simple parts. If you can draw it, you can teach yourself later when you are tired. Leave places better than you found them if you can. A closed door after you use a shelter buys the next person time. Breathe before you step. Your voice is a tool. Use it rarely. On day 29, I moved along the edge of a neighborhood that backed onto a major road. An overpass loomed ahead with a billboard above it, the kind that shows the same image in 3 panels on a rotation. The panels were stuck between ads, half one thing and half another. Below it, a small gravel patch had enough room for me to sit with my back to a steel support. The spot was exposed to the sky but hidden from the road by an embankment. I set the moving blanket, placed my pack, and ate a small dinner. I watched the sun lower. The city to the southeast glowed dull with smoke haze. I heard a pop, then another, then nothing. The highway carried a few vehicles every half hour, probably official because the regular traffic was gone. At dusk, I heard a helicopter again. This time it approached from the south and hovered longer. I stood under the billboard and watched the sky instead of the city. A flare arced in the distance, and then a bright cluster of light bloomed and faded. I thought for a second about what that meant and then decided it was not information I could use. I sat back down, leaned against the support, and recorded the time and direction. The air cooled. I wrapped the blanket around my shoulders and closed my eyes. On day 30, I woke before dawn and faced my own deadline. In my log, 30 days was not a finish line. It was a metric, a way to prove that adaptation could outlast a bad month. I ate a steady breakfast, drank water, and looked across the highway at a line of trees that promised a quieter day, and an even quieter night if I walked past them. I looked back toward the city and thought of the rooftop courts of brick and tar that had held me safely for 3 weeks. I thought of the balcony with the flap of blanket and the rope basket and the mirror flashes at 10 a.m. I thought of the sound of metal washers touching the doorknob when I left and how small and bright it had sounded inside a quiet room. I decided not to go back. I decided to move forward in a slow line that would take me to a different set of buildings, with different hazards and a new plan. The mall near Crabtree Creek was somewhere to the north. The state fairgrounds were to the west. The university hospitals were to the southwest. All of those were the wrong choices because they were the first choices of too many other people. The right choice was the set of smaller places along the suburban edges where a person could sleep in a small office with a window that opened, or in a 2-car garage with a side door, or in a tree line that had a dry patch above a creek. I spent the morning under the billboard. When the sun climbed, I set my rainfly between 2 supports with paracord to make a small shade. I charged the solar light. I wrote the final 30-day page in my log. Day 30, alive, quiet, moving at dusk to the next line of trees. Rules valid. Adjust as needed. Strength is not stored in a bin. It is built in short pieces when you keep promises to yourself. Small skills kept me here: boiling water, taping a blanket, listening before moving, carrying only what I can control. I thought gear would solve this. It did not. Discipline did. Also luck, also the city itself, which has edges that let you pass if you pay attention. I do not know where help is, but I will not stand in the open and wait for it. The plan is to live another 30 and then write another page. In the late afternoon, I heard a vehicle on the overpass slow and then stop. I pulled the blanket back and watched through a gap. A utility truck with a light bar idled for a minute. 2 people in protective gear looked over the railing and then at a paper map. They talked quietly and then drove on. I waited 5 minutes, then 10. I stood, rolled the blanket, and shouldered my pack. I stepped off the gravel into the scrub and down the embankment toward the line of trees. I moved like I had learned to move. 1 step per breath, eyes scanning for edges and for the pieces of the city that could either help or harm. I followed the tree line to a small maintenance track. The track led toward a cluster of low buildings that looked like storage or light industrial. They had roofs and walls and corners. They had doors that opened to the air, not to long hallways. They had fewer people and more exits. When the sun touched the horizon, I stopped at the edge of the track and listened. I could hear birds. I could hear my own breath. I could hear the faint thrum of the highway a few blocks away. I could not hear footsteps. I moved again. In a storage yard, I found an old billboard ladder lying on the ground. I checked it for stability and found most rungs solid. I carried it to a low wall behind one of the buildings and leaned it at a shallow angle. It would make a good ramp for a future crossing if I needed to move roof to roof again. I left it there because it would be more useful if it looked like trash until I needed it. I did not mark it on the wall. I marked it in my head and in my notebook. I set my small camp for the night in the sheltered corner of a loading bay, where a concrete overhang kept the dew off. I placed the solar light so it would not silhouette me if I turned it on. I ate a measured dinner, drank water, and rolled the blanket to make a firm pillow so my neck would not cramp. I set 2 watches, one at midnight, one before dawn. In the last light of day 30, I looked back toward the city one more time. The skyline was gray. A faint haze hung above it. No sirens, no helicopters, no crowds, just a long, low quiet. I thought of the first week, the way I taped the vents and moved the couch, how small those actions seemed at the time, and how they had turned into a system that kept me alive long enough to learn more. I thought of Mr. Kim's signs and the advice he gave that stopped me from chasing generator noise and fires. I thought of the rope basket and the batteries and the cup of rice that was more than it looked like on paper. I turned away from the view and toward the dark yard that would be home for 12 hours. I closed my eyes and pictured the next morning as a set of tasks rather than a wall of unknowns. Wake before dawn. Check shoes. Check back. Move along the fence line. Reach the next stand of trees. Locate a new shelter by 6:30 a.m. Write in the log. Drink water. Eat breakfast. Clean the pot. Listen. Watch. Stay quiet. These were not heroics. They were the opposite. They were the small, boring steps that fit together to make a bridge across a month the city thought no one could cross. I slept, woke to my watch alarm at 11:55 p.m., and looked at the sky through the gap above the loading bay. It was clear. The air felt cooler than the night before. The city hummed low and far. I turned the alarm off and closed my eyes again. When the watch ended, I turned on my side, with my pack under my arm and the screwdriver handle under my palm, the same as I slept on day 1. It was a habit that made sense. I did not need to change everything. I needed to keep what worked and cut what did not. I needed to be an ordinary person who learned fast and did not argue with reality. In the morning, I would get up and start day 31. I would find water again and cook again and eat with numbers in my head and a map under my hand. I would avoid loud places and people who wanted to solve their fear by making mine worse. I would keep to greenways and alleys and rooftops and loading bays. I would signal if it was safe to signal and stay silent if it was not. I would not stand in an open parking lot and wish for the past. I would not walk into a crowd. The city would not make anything easy. It did not need to. It only needed to be what it was. I could be what I was and still live. A person who kept a small kit, wrote a clean log, saved water, taped a blanket, cooked quietly, and used a mirror to make a friend across a courtyard. An ordinary prepper who survived the first month because I stopped trying to be more and started trying to be exact. When I finally slept, it was the first real sleep I had in days. I did not dream about the apartment or the fire or the sound in the hallway. I did not dream about sirens. I dreamed about writing Day 31 at the top of a clean page with a working pencil, and the sound of the graphite on paper was quiet and steady, and it was enough. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support keeps these creepypastas coming. Until next time, stay alert, stay safe, and never ignore the feeling that something is watching.